Hollow pommels. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So I have spoken quite a bit in the past about hollow pommels, and something that a lot of people who don't necessarily look at originals of swords, that is actual examples in museums or antiques, don't necessarily realise if they've only seen pictures of swords, is when you see a great big massive round pommel like this, very often they're hollow. And I have seen lots of not so great reproduction swords that made a sword that looked like this but made the pommel solid, and therefore it handled completely differently to the original sword. Obviously if you make that solid rather than hollow, it means the point of balance is going to be completely different. It's going to be way closer to the hand, and also the total weight of the weapon is going to be too heavy. Why don't you want a point of balance that's really close to the hand? Well, quite simply, if you have a cutting sword, for example, you want it to have a certain amount of heft up at the hitting end of the blade. You want it to be able to hit with some authority. If you make a massively heavy pommel at the back end of the sword, the blade wants to come back like that, and when you try and power it forward, you're kind of fighting against the mass or the inertia of the pommel, trying to get the pommel moving as well as getting the blade moving. So there's a balance. Pommels do act as counterweights on many types of swords. They're not always counterweights on all types of swords. On some types of swords, the pommel is simply there to stop your hand slipping off the end of the grip, and that's maybe something I'll examine in a separate video in the future, that specific topic. But quite simply, pommels are often counterweights, but they have to be the correct amount of mass. But for numerous reasons, you might want your pommel to be large. Now, if you want your pommel to be large, but you for example, to stop your hand slipping off, or some other reason, but you don't want it to be immensely heavy, what do? You make it hollow. Now, you can find hollow pommels on all different types of swords from all over the world, different cultures, different periods. An example is this kind of spherical globular pommel is very often hollow on many European swords from the medieval period right the way through the Renaissance. But equally, many wheel pommels, so-called wheel pommels on medieval swords, are often, if not entirely hollow, they're often partially hollow. So what you often find, the so-called Henry V sword, which is probably not Henry V's sword, in Westminster Abbey, which I've showed a replica of in previous videos, is an example of that. And that pommel is partially hollow, so it looks really massive. And if you made a replica where that pommel was solid, the pommel would be hugely overweight, and it would give you a completely different impression of what that sword feels like to hold. But when you actually look at the original, you find that the raised portions of the pommel, of the sort of rib of the pommel, are actually hollow, brazed on sections. And so a large part of that pommel is actually hollow, which means that a lot of the sort of mass and authority is left in the blade for hitting people with, which is obviously quite useful in a sword. But before I wrap it up, because this is just an unusually quick video for me, and I'm not going to mention butts or penetration, I'm simply going to go straight to more pommels, and mention the fact that here I have a Chinese dao, or dao, which just means knife, actually. So that, as I understand it, the Chinese word dao is very similar to the German word Messer. So dadao, I believe, means big knife, and Langmesser means long knife. So it's a very similar thing, and actually it's a similar kind of weapon. It's a single-edged cleaver, really, or kind of machete-like blade on a fairly simple utilitarian hilt. And I have to say, not of very high quality. These were churned out for mostly, I believe, conscripts or conscripted, drafted Chinese militias in conflicts such as the Boxer Rebellion or the kind of Opium Wars, this kind of stuff in the 19th century, and of course earlier periods. And they churned out these swords and gave them to fairly low class levies as sidearms. And what I found interesting about it, because I've never had one of these, I've handled them before but I've never actually owned one before, is that this pommel, which looks spherical and not dissimilar to, well, it looks like a smaller version perhaps of a medieval European sword pommel, is kind of shaped a little bit like a Brazil nut, but a bit more round than that. And looking at a picture, you would assume that that might be solid, that it might be a solid lump, and if someone might make a replica of this type of sword, they might indeed make that as a solid lump. But it is not even remotely a solid lump. It is purely two welded, probably forge welded, plates either side. A bit like a helmet that's been welded up the centre, like a lot of modern reenactment helmets are. And so it is absolutely hollow. It has some mass because obviously it's made of iron or steel, but it is a really hollow cap. It's more, that's how you should think of it. It's more like an end cap rather than a counterbalance, so to speak. So does it stop the hand sliding off the end? Yep, potentially it could do. Whether you're holding it one or two-handed, it could give it a slightly better grip if you were using the weapon two-handed and help prevent the hand sliding off if you're using it one-handed. But does it provide any counterbalancing effect? Not really, no. It's not got very much mass to it at all. And the point of balance on this particular example is way out there. It's, what is that? That's about 8 inches, I guess, from the... you're going to make jokes about what my estimation of 8 inches now, but it's about 8 inches, I would imagine, from the guard. This really, if you took that pommel cap off, would it change the point of balance much on the sword? Probably not really much at all. The length of the tang or the length of the grip is probably having a greater counterbalancing effect than the actual little bit of iron at the end there. It might have, you know, it might change it by a centimetre, something like that. So, so there we go, really, just to say, lots of pommels all over the world, all different periods, going right the way back to ancient times and right the way through to modern times. Some of them have been hollow, and not all pommels are there as counterbalances per se. Some pommels are just there to stop your hand slipping off the end. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.